Hello and welcome to Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, and this is hopefully an extra funky edition of Zilog and Moto, especially compared to last week's look at Junction for the Genesis. Yeah, I gotta be honest, Junction was not the most exciting game I've reviewed on the channel, by a lot. But you'll have that sometimes when you're doing what I'm doing here. What is that exactly? Well, returning viewers will know, but just in case this is your first visit to the channel, I've got this crazy goal of collecting, playing, and reviewing every English language title for the Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. Basically, if I can play it on a Genesis with or without some sort of add-on, and read what's on the screen, I'm trying to pick up a copy of it and put it through its paces and then report back on what I find, including a look at the original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware. And that could be a very European release, like European Club Soccer for the Mega Drive, that I've got coming up later this year. Or it could be a very American release, like what I'm taking a look at this week. Picture this, it's late 1991 and the Genesis is just hitting its popularity stride while simultaneously trying to fend off the debuting Super Nintendo. As part of that effort, Sonic the Hedgehog came out the previous summer, and Streets of Rage was released before the Super Nintendo port of Final Fight could hit the market in the United States. Sega needed more titles to keep the momentum going, and they got one from Johnson Vorsanger Productions, who managed to come out of seemingly nowhere with the now iconic Toe Jam and Earl. I reviewed Toe Jam and Earl back in episode 95, toward the end of season 2, and I thought it had held up very well over the last 30 years, with it possibly being one of the most original roguelike games ever released. Or at least I know that now anyway. When I played it as a kid, I had no idea what rogue was or what the term meant, which I guess is one of the benefits of going back and reviewing these games now. Toe Jam and Earl worked not just because of its originality, but because of its unique sense of humor that pervaded the entire game, and an entertaining cast of characters in both main aliens Toe Jam and Earl, and also the slate of enemies that you have to avoid as you make your way through the game, which got more and more intense the further you get. Also, the nature of the procedurally generated landscapes was something that I definitely had never run into before playing Toe Jam and Earl, so it seemed like magic to be able to play a game and it never be the same experience twice. But this review isn't for Toe Jam and Earl, it's for its sequel, Toe Jam and Earl Panic on Funkotron. This game was released in late 1993, hitting the shelves around Christmas in the United States, and it is a significant departure from the original Toe Jam and Earl, with the game switching to a much more traditional two-dimensional side-scrolling game, and stands alone as the only game in the series that plays in this manner. Apparently, Johnson and Vorsanger originally had planned for this game to use the same style of play as the rest of the Toe Jam and Earl series, but Sega of America specifically stepped in and suggested that maybe the game be made as a side-scroller instead because they thought that it would sell better, which is how we ended up here. Now, I don't know about you, but usually when I hear the words Sega of America suggested something, I've got a serious cause for concern. But in the case of Toe Jam and Earl Panic on Funkotron, maybe they were onto something? We shall see, but first, a look at the package. And this is my copy of Toe Jam and Earl Panic on Funkotron. This copy has held up okay, but it's definitely seen some use. I should probably try getting out the old rubbing alcohol at some point and going over the outer cover. The inner cover seems okay though, with no sun bleaching or water damage, but it does seem a bit dingy on the edges. I'm thinking that this might have been a copy belonging to a former smoker maybe. I could probably try getting a better looking copy if I wanted to, as it's currently only going for about $35 complete on price charting, but I'm okay with this one. Believe it or not, the original game is much more desirable, at least from a cost rarity standpoint, and while I more than likely just picked this up at Disc Replay or something, I think I ended up resorting to eBay to purchase the original game, just due to not seeing it very often around here. As far as the front cover goes, I think it's great. It's one of the Genesis Red Band releases, but that's not always a bad thing, and the art here does a good job of making the most out of the available real estate, and it uses colors that contrast well with that red band, making the cover that much more eye-catching. I could be wrong, but it really seems like the art was designed knowing that that particular formatting was going to be used, whereas a lot of other covers just seem like they created their art in a vacuum and then just slapped it in the available window, not really caring how it came across. The European version, on the other hand, is one of the last games to still use the black cross-hatching formatting to the cover, and normally I do prefer those versions of the covers, but in this case I think I've got to give it to the American version, as the art on the European cover seems to be zoomed in a bit too far and just looks a little odd. Also, in a weird turn, Germany got their own version of the game, this time using the newer blue Mega Drive formatting, and I think that's a cool novelty. With the German title here and the art overlapping the borders, I always dig when they do that. You might be wondering why I haven't mentioned a Japanese cover, and that's because there isn't one. For whatever reason, Panic on Funkotron didn't get a Japanese release. But it did come out in South Korea and Taiwan, so figure that one out. Flipping over the back, and you can tell it's a later release with the stylized appearance of screenshots running down diagonally to the left side, almost as if they're stills from a film strip. I suppose it gets points for presentation, but I don't love how the screenshots are cut off in most cases. It kinda defeats the purpose of trying to show you what the game looks like. But at least all of them are of decent quality and not repetitive at all. The flavor text and tagline at the top do a solid job of describing the game's backstory and making you want to play the game, but I don't know about the third bullet point, which basically is just hyping the underwater sections of levels as a big deal. I would have axed that and put something about the funk vac or hitting the panic button, or just something that wasn't part of your average platformer. Just ask anyone who's played Sonic the Hedgehog, they weren't exactly super excited about Labyrinth Zone. Opening up the case, and you can see how the manual has definitely seen some use. And there's certainly plenty to read in here. In fact, I'd almost say that the manual has a bit too much text, because when you get down to it, it's really not a very complicated game, and the manual actually makes it seem more complicated than it actually is. I do, however, like the fact that the first page acknowledges that some people don't like reading manuals, and then you've got the intro wrap that sets up the game's backstory, and then the section at the end that details all your friends and the different humans that you have to catch, complete with how many jars each one takes. Something that you'll probably figure out as you play, but it's very convenient to have written down here for reference. Okay, that's the package. Let's get our funk on and try to help ToeJam and Earl save Funkotron from those nasty Earthlings. I mentioned earlier that ToeJam and Earl Panic on Funkotron is a pretty big departure from not just the previous game, but also, as it turns out, the entire series, with both ToeJam and Earl 3 Mission to Earth, which was released for the original Xbox back in 2002, and the latest game, ToeJam and Earl Back in the Groove, which came out for modern consoles in 2019, having much more in common with the playstyle of the original game, although Back in the Groove did have its own version of the Hyperfunk Zone from Panic on Funkotron, so that was a nice way to reference the game. Having a sequel to a fairly popular original title be based in a genre that's different from the original game is pretty unusual, as in most cases, developers and publishers are more content to dance with what brought them, for both ease of development reasons and because they don't want to upset the fans that are spending money on the game. And due to that, the few times when this has been tried in the past usually hasn't worked out too well for everyone involved. In fact, I'm struggling to even think of good examples when companies have tried this. Sure, there's various platformers like Sonic, Super Mario Bros., and even Gex, where the game started out as 2D side-scrollers and then turned into 3D adventures due to the advent of more powerful technology which allowed for it. But even all those titles were still platformers, just with an extra dimension. About the only series I can even think of that had a change like what I'm describing is maybe Golden Axe, with the first 4 games in the series being solidly beat-em-ups, and then Golden Axe Beast Rider coming along later as more of a standard 3D action title. But I could also see the argument for Beast Rider being more of a spin-off than an actual series title like Golden Axe Warrior or Axe Battler. Regardless of any of that, Panic on Funkotron is clearly its own title in the series, sharing only its main characters and perhaps some of the sound effects and music with the original ToeJam and Earl. Okay, maybe the unusual text font as well, but that's it. It's a bold new direction for the series, and one that I actually applaud because it really forced the game designers to not just reuse things, for the most part, from the first title, which is something that a lot of sequels get into trouble with, and end up feeling like cheap cash grabs and rehashes. To set up the plot of the game, if you finish the original ToeJam and Earl, the last level, so to speak, was after the boys, as they're referred to on the back of the box, had managed to reassemble their spaceship and finally escape Earth and head back to Funkotron. They land on Funkotron and then walk around the map talking to their fellow Funkotronians before finally getting to their house. It's a cool ending and something that I really appreciated the developers giving players as an award for all their hard work to make it through the game. And it made Funkotron appear to be a real place, and not just some construct to set up a reason for playing the game. That ending serves as the bridge between the two games, and when you boot up Panic on Funkotron, it feels like you're now in that world, albeit just with a different perspective. The color scheme appears bright and vibrant, harkening back to that last level, and ToeJam and Earl are no longer alone, as they now have the ability to interact with their friends like they did when they were welcomed home. But of course, we can't have a new game without conflict, and wouldn't you know it, those pesky Earthlings that you worked so hard to escape in the first game managed to hitch a ride on your spaceship and are now causing all sorts of chaos on Funkotron, and now it's up to you to clean up the mess. Due to a handy newscast at the beginning of the game pointing out that ToeJam and Earl were most likely responsible for the Earthling infection. After taking a beat to think about what they're going to do to try to fix things, they come up with the idea of capturing the Earthlings in jars and then shipping them back to Earth via a rocket. Because, of course, the logical thing to do when you're trying to capture a bunch of random humans is to put them in jars. Just tell yourself it's an alien planet and things don't necessarily have to make sense. Maybe the rules of physics work different there, who knows? To clean up Funkotron, the game features 17 new levels to comb through in an effort to find all the humans, and each level features a few different named areas connected together. While most of above-ground Funkotron has a similar look to it, much like how Earth was in the first game, the developers did a good job of mixing up the backgrounds and music to each level to make it feel like you were actually in different areas, rather than just going through the same level over and over again, just with a different platform layout. Also, some levels do have variations, like some levels have above-ground ice and snow, which can lead to sliding mechanics, or the inclusion of both underground areas that feature fire as a danger, and the underwater sections that were mentioned on the back of the box. There's not as much variety in the levels as some other platformers have, where entire worlds get dedicated to different themes, but as far as Panic on Funkotron is concerned, it works, and actually gives the world a more cohesive feel than some of those other titles, where they sometimes feel like the levels have to have different themes, because otherwise the game would be boring. Even though you could technically call the action in the game repetitive, one thing Panic on Funkotron never has to worry about is being boring. One of the things that Panic on Funkotron nails is something that the original ToeJam and Earl did well also, and that's how the game handles difficulty progression. The first few levels of the game will probably see you cruising through without much difficulty, with food power-ups to regain your health being abundant, and not that many humans to deal with the ones that you do have to capture being on the easier end of the spectrum. And then you hit the middle third of the game, around level 6 or 7, and things start to get tricky. Poodles will become the bane of your existence, along with boogeymen back from the first game. Actually, the boogeymen aren't quite as much of a pain here as they were in that first game. The problem usually comes in their quantities, as oftentimes there will be multiple ones together, and you'll think you're safe after capturing the first one, and then all of a sudden another one will pop up right behind you. Thankfully, unlike the first game, Panic on Funkotron includes a save system in the way of passwords. After level 3, every 2 levels you're provided a password, allowing you to continue your game if you need to take a break, or more than likely have had a run of bad luck and lost a ton of lives or had to burn a bunch of power-ups. I know a lot of people aren't crazy about passwords, but they're certainly better than nothing, and the passwords in Panic on Funkotron keep track of all your lives, funk, coins, and power-ups, so they're as close to a battery backup save as you can have. And they're not too terribly complex to input, should you need to restart.
This is actually one of my favorite features of the game because with the passwords being spaced out every 2 levels, you still have to put together a decent string of gameplay to make it to the next password, rather than just cheesing your way level by level. I mentioned earlier that the gameplay in Panic on Funkotron is relatively simple, certainly simpler than the manual makes it out to seem, and in fact I'd say it's probably simpler than even the first game, due to all the different presents and power-ups that were available in the original ToeJam and Earl. However, even with its simplicity, this is a game that was made for the 6-button controller, and as a result, if you have one, you'll definitely have a better time if you use it. For the most part, you'll be using the B button to throw jars and the C button to jump, but occasionally when things get really hairy, you want to either engage panic mode by hitting Y or pulling out the ultimate in human jarring technology, the Funk Vacuum, by hitting Z. Both of which you have to collect as you search around, so there's definitely some strategies to when you use them versus trying to pick off individual Earthlings. There's also your Funk Scan on X, which acts as a radar for detecting hidden helpful and harmful things. And finally the Funk Move, which allows you to teleport through walls by hitting A, both of which are nice features for being able to search out all the secrets in the game. All the controls fit perfectly onto the 6 buttons of the controller, and you'll very quickly be able to pick up and play the game. I spent almost no time at all getting reacclimated to things, even after having not touched the game for almost 30 years, which was nice, and I think my only complaint was with the gameplay that sometimes the jumps are a bit touchy when you get close to the edge of a platform, but even that's something you start to get used to after a while. The graphics in Panic on Funkotron are a huge upgrade over what was present in the original ToeJam and Earl. If you've played that game or seen footage of it, you probably know that it was a title that featured a whole lot of black, green, and yellow in the background, with some nicely drawn but fairly small sprites. Panic on Funkotron, on the other hand, leaves no doubt that ToeJam and Earl are no longer in Kansas. Funkotron is wildly colorful, making great use of the Genesis color palette, and features some decent-sized sprites, with both the main characters, NPCs, and the Earthlings all being very detailed and well animated. If I had one complaint about the graphics in the game, well, it's more of a complaint about the game engine rather than the graphics, but due to how zoomed in the camera is, frequently platforms that you need to jump to are off camera, and there's no way to move the camera around without actually moving your character. So there's lots of times when you'll be doing things blindly and having to guess how much or little you should jump. It's not a deal breaker, especially since there's no pits to fall in where you would lose a life, but it does make certain areas a bit more annoying than they probably should be. From a sound perspective, if you've played the first game, this one's going to sound very familiar. I mentioned earlier how I liked when Panic on Funkotron was very different due to being a different genre, which forced them to not reuse assets. But that's only partially true. The main theme music is back, and some of the original sound effects from the first game have been brought back as well. Thankfully, there's still plenty of original music that's been added, and a few new sound effects to go along with the new Earthlings, and it all sounds very ToeJam and Earl. So if you like the sound from the first game, you're going to like what's presented here. I'm definitely a fan, and while I think I would have liked to have heard maybe a few more new effects, I really can't complain. ToeJam and Earl Panic on Funkotron is a great sequel to the original game, and a more than worthy member of the series. I think it's been a bit overlooked over the years just due to the fact that it was a different kind of game, and because it was a later release in the Genesis library. And that's unfortunate because in looking at the game, other than it being different than perhaps what people were expecting, it does almost everything incredibly well. Sure, I think there's some aspects of the platforming that probably could have been tightened up a little bit, but those are really minor things, and the game is forgiving enough to where if you miss a jump or slip off a platform, you can usually get right back there without too much trouble. And the game is loaded with hidden items and quirky small puzzles to reward players who want to be a little more thorough and expand their adventure, versus just simply going left to right and bagging enemies. As a result, I'm giving ToeJam and Earl Panic on Funkotron 4 stars, just like the original. It's a wholly original platforming adventure that should be in everyone's Genesis library, and is great fun with a perfect level of difficulty for either solo play or with a friend.
And that was ToeJam and Earl Panic on Funkotron for the Genesis. I had a great time revisiting this game this week, and I was really glad that it was just as good as I remembered it being from when I played it originally back in the 90s. I probably should have gotten some footage of me playing as Earl as well, and I'm kind of surprised that he didn't show up in the ending when you play as ToeJam, but just getting the video done this week was a chore, as my PC is apparently on its last legs, and I'll be having to do a major upgrade before doing the next video. Yay! Next time on Zilog and Moto, well, you're not going to believe this, but I've messed the schedule up yet again. Yeah, I know. Next week I was supposed to be reviewing Pac-Mania for the Genesis, since I reviewed the Master System version back in episode 96. However, when I went to go look at the shelf, I got Pac-Attack and Pac-Man 2 and Miss Pac-Man, but somehow I've never managed to pick up the Genesis version of Pac-Mania. Oops. I'll work on that, and instead next week I'll be bumping up a game which had been requested in the comments that I really don't know much about, other than it's been described as a medieval version of Populous. We'll see how that goes. Come to think of it, I still need a copy of Populous. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto, episode 195. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.